Okay, if we can start with a nice easy question, how would you define a microgrid?
Yeah, so a microgrid is really an integrated energy system that consists of interconnected loads and distributed energy resources. And what I mean by that is kind of generation assets, energy storage assets, and then the loads that we can control. And we can do all of this, we can control all of this as a single entity. We can do it in parallel with the grid. So you've got a grid connection there. Or you could take yourself into what we call an island mode. So you're operating independently from the grid. And really, the aim of the game is to allow kind of power consumers to become prosumers. So using those distributed energy resources, so things like your solar panels and your battery storage systems, to allow you to choose when you store, sell, produce, or consume your electricity. So you're kind of operating your own grid, your microgrid on site that you can have connected to the grid, or you can set yourself off grid.
Okay, and in terms of the main benefits of deploying a microgrid, I'm thinking there must be something around energy cost savings, uh, potentially you're improving energy resilience or your independence from the grid, and also sustainability. I guess it's a more sustainable, potentially a more sustainable way of consuming power. Just your thoughts as to those benefits and any others.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think of sustainability first, if you're able to produce renewable energy on site, then obviously that's, a nice big tick in that sustainability box. But we want to try to make sure that we're using as much of that renewable energy as possible. So, it's not just a case of, sticking some solar panels on the roof and just forgetting about it. It's making sure that we're capturing all of that energy wherever it's coming from and making the most of it. This then starts to flow into the cost saving piece. So if you're able to produce energy on site at a lower price than you're paying from the grid, if you can store any of that energy and then use that in a way, if you could discharge those batteries, for instance, during a peak tariff period, then overall you're probably going to see a reduction in what you're paying to purchase that energy from your utility supplier. And then obviously in terms of independence and resiliency, if you've got the ability to generate energy on site and you've got some saved, then you've got that element of backup power. But a big kind of an important piece at the minute is really enabling kind of using microgrids to either support existing grid connections or maybe to reduce the requirement from the grid. So if you can supplement an existing connection with on-site generation and storage, and then use that to give yourself, additional power during times that you need it, then that might enable you to, develop the project faster or to expand your site. So yeah, absolutely, all three of those things. Different customers have different drivers, and they pursue different, kind of aspects of them. It's usually all three. That sustainability story is really important. But a lot of the time it starts with, I'm looking to electrify things, or I'm looking to, expand my campus and I want to do it in a sustainable way. That means more electricity. Well, if you can't get that electricity for a number of years, well, then you can look at deploying, those assets on site to kind of support that. So it's all three of them. It could just be one of them. It really depends on, kind of what those users are going to do with it.
But yeah, but I guess that as you said, you led with sustainability, and I mean the world is becoming increasingly digital, but there's also this focus on decarbonisation. So we've got digitalisation on the one hand, decarbonisation on the other. So um, with that landscape, microgrids have an increasingly important role to play going forward. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And it's not just the microgrid, it's really what we can do in terms of efficiency as well. So it's looking at kind of efficiency throughout that whole chain. So we need to make sure that the operations within the data center are efficient. This could come in the form of, just upgrading equipment or installing the most efficient equipment, whether this is, your UPSs or your transformers. Making sure that the embodied carbon of the things that you're installing is as low as possible. That's kind of an important sustainability aspect. Selecting the right technology. So again, kind of within the data center, if you think of kind of the advanced liquid cooling technology that's available now, if you take two data centers with the same server density, and if you look at one with air cooling and one with liquid cooling, then you can achieve, 60, 70% energy reduction just from using the liquid cooling technology. Or then as we look to higher server densities, so particularly around AI and things like this, then we can keep them at a similar level as if if it was the old style of data center and with the air cool technology. So really what we're doing is we're optimizing what we're using, and then we can take steps to kind of decarbonize that further along the chain, whether that's through microgrids or just sourcing renewables.
Yeah, and the mention of the topic of the day, AI there, how much more sort of pressure is again there's the hype and the reality, and I expect everyone has their slightly different views to, how big will be this AI boom, but just your thoughts as to how much more pressure AI will be putting on data center power infrastructure, and therefore why microgrids might, again, become more important in a sort of scenario where more and more power is required, and there maybe aren't the grid resources to provide all of that.
Yeah, so there are lots of estimates out there of kind of how much power usage is going to increase because of AI. As I mentioned, kind of making sure that we're as efficient as possible is going to be hugely important, but also kind of decoupling, your operation from that energy supply. And microgrid is a way to do that. So as we know, there are lots of countries that are struggling in terms of grid availability and power availability, whether that's because they're not able to generate enough, or which might be more commonly the case actually because they're able to generate enough, but they just can't transmit it to where it needs to be. If we're able to kind of use the microgrid technology to support that transition, so deploying that on-site generation, deploying that storage, reducing that burden on the grid, and then just giving it kind of everything the time to catch up. I think that's going to be hugely important. Um, and then there's also the piece around kind of enabling growth. So, if people are looking to, rapidly deploy AI or, whatever the technology is going to be, kind of high performance computing, they want to do that quickly. It feels a bit like a race. So they're going to choose locations, where that power is available, and preferably, where it's green and cheap and all of those good things. So actually, if you're able to do that decoupling aspect, so reducing that reliance on the grid, not take it away completely, but just reduce the reliance on it and supplement that with on-site generation and some smart technology that can enable you to forecast your loads and forecast generation ability, then I think that could be really useful in achieving the growth that people are expecting.
Okay, and in terms of the microgrid technology, I guess, I mean, you've got in the background there wind turbines, see the solar. I don't know whether I know nuclear, whether people allow that to be renewable or not, or clean. But I know there are some companies promoting small scale nuclear as a, I guess, an on-site power solution. Just I suppose your thoughts as to where the technology, for folks looking at them, do they need to be nervous at all as to whether the technology is proven, or is it very much reliable and proven, and therefore they don't need to worry, or where are we with microgrid technology, I suppose?
A lot of it is proven, so obviously some of it is emerging. So you mentioned kind of the nuclear thing, so there's a lot of advancements there. But in terms of things like wind, we've had wind farms for ages, right? The technology is there. The control systems have been in data centers for a long time. It's how we start the backup generators. It's all existing technology. We're just using it in a different way. So, regardless of what that generation asset's going to be, things are hard to control. We can't control the sun and we can't control the wind. But what we can do is forecast the availability of it. So we can use weather data to forecast, what that generation profile is going to look like. If we then add storage into the mix, we can then decide when we need to use that storage, whether it's charging or discharging. We know how much we're able to take from the grid or even put back into the grid. And so what with the microgrids, we can really start to balance everything. And it's existing technology. We're just using it in a slightly different way.
Okay, and in terms of Schneider's involvement, clearly everyone knows you as a the I guess the biggest company, or certainly one of the biggest companies in the data center space. Around microgrids, I think if I remember correctly, you've got an EcoStruxure microgrid advisor tool. I mean, perhaps tell us about that, and any other ways in which you're contributing towards this microgrid, I guess, development, if that's the right word, yeah.
Yeah, so Microgrid Advisor, it's a cloud-based platform that really handles that energy optimization that I was just describing. So the way that it works quite simply is it will use weather data to forecast what your generation is going to be over the next 24 hours. But then it will use all of the on-site power meters and all of that historical data that it can gather, and it will forecast what the load profile is going to be for the same time period. So what we end up with is we know how much energy we're able to generate, how much energy we're going to need to use, and when, and then we can optimize accordingly. So if we know that we're able to produce enough to meet the demand, then we're happy. And if there's any excess, we can store it in the batteries or we can sell it back to the grid. If we know that we're not able to meet enough to produce enough to meet the demand, then we're going to have to buy something from the grid, right? So we can choose then when we do that. So that could be based on cost, it could be based on availability of the grid. And again, we can start to use all of these forecasts and the assets on site, so things like your energy storage, to really start to balance that system. So Microgrid Advisor is all kind of based on that the forecasting and the optimization of all of those resources. But then we'll have, kind of SCADA control systems. We've got a thing called microgrid operation, which is a fancy control system that's, kind of rule-based. And this will capture things in real time. So we can't just rely on the forecast. We're going to have the additional layers of protection so that, if we need to start a backup genset or if we need to do these other things, maybe turn on a fuel cell or, when do we discharge and charge the batteries, that's going to be happening on site. So there's a combination. So we can do, with the cloud compute, we can run all of these models to optimize everything. But then you still got your on-site control systems that are really going to do that coordination piece.
I'm also wondering, I mean, this might be a silly question, so apologies if it is, but in the same way that sort of modular data centers are, or prefab modulars are becoming quite popular, is that at all possible with microgrids? I mean, could you more or less build or large part of a microgrid plant off-site and deliver it to site, or is it more complicated than that?
Yes and no. I think it is more complicated than that. A lot of So really the key components is your generation assets, your storage assets, and then, kind of your switchgear and the controls. So if we know what's going to be connected, we can do a lot of work offsite in terms of, writing the software and doing, that pre-commissioning offsite. But then when it comes to actually deploying and, that on-site commissioning, we're going to have those generation resources connected. So there's a lot we can do on the front end in terms of getting things ready, but then you're still going to have the element of site work as you connect these on-site resources. But it's interesting you mention kind of the modular data centers, because I think one of the nice things about AI, if you will, is that we're not so reliant on the location of them. So for certain use cases, it doesn't have to be in the city of London. It could be, closer to the source of energy. So whether that's deploying an on-site microgrid or just putting the data center next to or closer to a local resource, whether that's a wind farm or whatever it's going to be, and then using the microgrid again for all of that balancing, we can then start to, kind of change the location of where we're putting these things. And again, that can be a form of grid support. So if we're able to, decouple the data center from the grid location, so, maybe there's not a huge amount of availability in a certain region, but you don't need to be in that region. You just need to have the compute resource available. Then we can start to choose where we're putting them. And again, it's just making kind of better use of all of those energy resources that we've got.
Yeah, and I guess to that point as well, the fact that microgrids are also enable the use of waste heat for whether it's district heating or I guess co-located industry, to your point there, that plays to that point. So choosing a location where clearly you want to choose a location for the primary reasons why you want a data center there, but one of the nice additions, if you like, is the fact that you can locate it near, whether it's a school, public buildings, or on an industrial estate. But just your thoughts as to the potential for microgrids as sort of waste heat reuse suppliers, if that's the right phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you're right. Let's not just plonk them anywhere. Let's make sure there's a purpose for them. But we can be careful in where we choose for that. So as you said, maybe there's a school or hospital or an industrial use case for that heat. If we're able to use the microgrid to enable us to move the data center, then we can move the data center to a location where everything's going to be captured and used. So that could be waste heat, straight from the data center. But it could also be, from generation assets. So unfortunately, solar panels probably aren't going to power all of the data centers just yet. We need a huge amount of area of solar for the data center. So we could be looking at fuel cell technology or CHP using, biomethane or whatever the fuel source is going to be. So we can still use green fuels. But in that process, there's going to be a lot of heat on the generation side as well. So what we can do is we can start to capture that heat, and then, as you said, put that into a district heating system, or put it into an industrial process, and you kind of enable them to start to decarbonize.
Okay, so I suppose the big question, again, it's perhaps a bit unfair to ask, but in terms of the potential for microgrids as to, sort of where they are now in the data center industry and where you think they could become, whether it's to the end of this decade or further on, just your thoughts as to how common they will, can we imagine that virtually every data center that has enough space next to it will have a microgrid because it makes sense, or just your thoughts as to how the market might develop.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that all data centers are already microgrids because you've already got that on-site generation for the backup purposes. In terms of how microgrids, kind of the onset is going to develop, I don't know. I hope it really takes off, and I can see it doing so. But I think the growth is really, or maybe it's kind of enabling the growth of data centers, taking away some of those limitations around the grid and availability of power. So, where projects might be stalled for a period of time until grid reinforcement works have happened, or we can, make some power available in a certain location. I think the microgrid's actually going to enable growth in that sense, rather than kind of data centers, kind of enabling the growth of microgrids.
Although I suppose I mean, just occurred to me with the build out of the edge, and again, can have a separate conversation as to what an edge data center is, if you like, what size it is. But with this sort of second stage of AI, the inferencing and applications out there, and the edge may be growing, would microgrids potentially make sense in that, where we're talking more smaller data centers in less, say, centralized locations, big cities, as you mentioned, so would building a microgrid to augment whatever power supply was available there, would that make sense? So you could maybe have, as you say, solar panels. You wouldn't necessarily need vast amounts of solar panels or wind power to support them. Just is that a potential expand area for expansion?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things with microgrids, or maybe the traditional grid, everything was quite centralized. Centralized power station that was going to, kind of down the big cable to supply homes and businesses and everything else. We were really good at supplying power to, large cities and towns, not so great at getting it to rural locations. But now if you look at, so the wind farm in my background, that's going to be a rural use case. But still, we're trying to get the power back into the cities. Well, actually, if we don't need to be in the city for the data center because we're able to, use the microgrid, we can then start to, kind of move away. So yeah, I really see, well, exactly what you said, microgrids kind of enabling that transition. On the smaller side, yes, it's easier to build the smaller ones in terms of, you don't need as much land. But also, there are ways that we can do it, so we can, with back to the supplementing the grid. So, if it's a larger data center, then it could be a case of supplementing the grid with the on-site resources. So there's a case of both of them. And I'm not sure, what the future holds in terms of, is it going to be huge kind of AI data center campuses or lots of small ones? Might be a combination of both. And I think microgrids have got a role to play in both of those cases.
Yeah, and bearing in mind the predicted expansion of the data center industry, whether it's purely for these AI factories or just the digital world continues to expand, and the potential shortfall of power availability. Again, you can read different statistics, but there is a suggestion that at some point data center capacity and power availability will not match. In that potential scenario, I guess again, microgrids have a very critical role to play in potentially augmenting whatever power can be got to the data center. Oh, clearly, a data center needs a reliable source of power, but bearing in mind this scenario where there might be more sort of brownouts, blackouts, whatever you want to call them, is it a good idea for data center owner operators to investigate microgrids as a sort of backup? They've obviously, as you say, got their backup generators, but a sort of larger scale power backup. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so I think so. If like the grid today, there's renewables becoming more and more prevalent. So there's I don't know the exact numbers, but a large amount of the power that we use, from the centralized grid is coming from renewables. So they are still intermittent resources, but actually that's in the grid anyway. So if you were able to, kind of put that onto your data center site, but then use the microgrid technology with all of the forecasting and the AI predictives, then I think so. You're always going to have that backup power, regardless of if you've got your grid connection or not. We could have more power sources if you go down the route of microgrid. You can have kind of almost direct control over those sources, whether that's solar, wind, CHP, whatever it's going to be, and your grid connection. I'm not saying do over grid connections completely. So I think that it's just about finding the balance. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and I mean, I've taken a lot of your time, and I've asked you a lot of, I won't say obscure questions, but questions that fascinate me, and you've given some tremendous insights into microgrids and their potential in the data center industry, and it's a fast-moving situation, so I'm sure there'll be more to come. But at least for now, David, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.